Stephen Harper has won minority governments before and carried on as Prime Minister with periodic support from one of the other parties. In this election, however, both the Liberal and NDP leaders are saying they could not support Harper, whatever the result.
There are no circumstances in which I would support Stephen Harper to continue being Prime Minister of this country.
There isn't a snowball's chance in hell.
So how would this likely happen? The leaders have acknowledged that in our system, the sitting Prime Minister has the first chance to form a government, especially if he has won the most seats in a general election.
Certainly, if Mr. Harper has the most seats after the election, he can go to the Governor-General and say, I got the most seats, so I get to try. But that's the sentence. He gets to try. He doesn't get to say, I'm here for 4 years. We have the House of Commons will decide who's going to be the Prime Minister for how long. And we should never lose sight of that. That's our system.
In a Conservative minority situation, the Governor-General would likely allow Mr. Harper to form a government and even have a speech from the throne about his government's legislative intentions, but then he would face a vote of confidence to see if he could command the support of the House of Commons. That is when the other party leaders suggest they would defeat his government. He could then resign or ask the Governor-General to hold new elections. The Governor-General also has the option of asking the leader of the next largest party to try to form a government. Former Conservative Senator Hugh Segal says the Governor-General must consider who has a legitimate right to govern.
This is a Governor-General who is particularly well-versed in constitutional matters, so he has, I think, great preparation for this. He will understand that by convention and by constitutional history, his duty is to the continuity of government. So if there's any way that a government can continue and do its job and still be legitimate, he has a duty to be constructive and supportive. He's not driven by polls. He'd want to know what legitimacy the other parties who wish to form a government after a confidence vote might have. And he'd have to assess that and weigh it based on the circumstance at the time.
Perhaps the best example of the winning party being knocked out of power occurred in the Ontario provincial election of 1985. Premier Frank Miller won more seats than David Peterson's Liberals, and to sustain him in a minority parliament, he turned to the third party, the New Democrats, led at the time by Bob Rae. The Conservatives offered to let the NDP name any price for their support.
Well, they wanted to be very generous. It wasn't about that. It wasn't about what was on offer. It was about, I think, a political judgment on the part of the New Democrats at the time that it was time for a change, and that there was enough of a common agenda between the Liberals and the New Democrats that it could create an agenda for a government, and it did for 2 years.
It's been a process of consultation, of negotiation, of give and take.
The Ontario NDP and Liberals signed a formal accord laying out a legislative agenda and a guarantee that there would be no election for at least 2 years. A few years ago, on a visit to Britain, Harper suggested that any sort of similar coalition of parties which lost the election would be somehow illegitimate.
Losers don't get to form coalitions. Winners are the ones who form governments.
That's just factually wrong, and it's an anti-democratic attitude. The democratic essence is to have the Legislative Assembly reflect the vote of the people, and then they put a configuration of parties together that will provide a majority vote in the House of Commons. And as long as that's done, it doesn't matter which particular parties do it. The key thing constitutionally is that when you add them up, they have majority support.
Some people are making the argument that if he has a plurality but not a majority, but if he's far ahead in seats, then it becomes politically very hard to do that. Is there some threshold in your mind?
No, it's 50% plus one. I mean, if he doesn't have his majority, he doesn't have a majority.
I disagree with Ed on that because it's one thing if there's been a huge shift, the government's hanging on by its fingernails and only has a few seats of a plurality. But if they have a substantive plurality and the other two parties have to put everything together to get 2 or 3 seats more, to use that particular example, I think there's a reality about the legitimacy with which that would be viewed by the public over time But I think the legitimacy issue, if there's a 50-seat plurality on behalf of the government, is very much running on the side of the government in the process.
The general feeling is that if the Conservatives were heavily outnumbered by the other two parties, Mr. Harper would likely give up power. If, however, he was just a few seats short of a majority, he would likely fight to hold on. Andrew McDougall, now working in London, England, served for years as Mr. Harper's Director of Communications.
Size does matter. It's kind of a mug's game to put a number on it. It's a bit like political pornography. You'll know it when you see it, and you'll know the margin when you see it. So we'll have to wait until Election Day. And I think if it's 1 or 2 or 5, that's a very different conversation than if it's more than that.
But there was a good public debate. Mr. Trudeau doesn't understand debates because he's used to having people write his lines for him. But with regard...
Tom Mulcair and Justin Trudeau have been sniping a lot at each other in this campaign, which Conservatives say will make it harder for them to get along after the election.
I think that the difficulty might be getting the cats and the dogs within the Liberal and NDP parties themselves to get to agree on what a program would look like. And Thomas Mulcair and Justin Trudeau have not sounded very identical in the last 10 weeks on a number of issues. So for them to put down their swords and suddenly, the cats and the dogs getting together, that would be the bigger boundary there than maybe what people who voted for them would want. And let's remember that nobody in this election is voting on the basis of what the NDP and Liberals would look like together.
What's more interesting, though, is when we looked at these...
How Liberal and NDP voters feel about their parties working together has been a preoccupation of pollster Frank Graves. In this eco-survey he shared with us, he found that to get rid of the Harper government, both Liberal and NDP voters overwhelmingly favor a coalition government. And who would be the new Prime Minister doesn't seem to matter.
And this reinforces the fact that the coalition is far from being a bogeyman or some kind of sketchy idea that we don't really want to try that. It's really an enormously resonant idea with frustrated voters on the center left today.
I think there's more visceral antipathy towards the Prime Minister than there has been in the recent past. And that reflects itself in many Canadians desiring the opposition parties, the New Democrats and the Liberals, to collaborate in some way.
We find there's scant distances between NDP and Liberal voters. Their level of commitment to those parties is subordinate to the desire to see change. So we find, for example, of the 2/3 of Canadians who say it's time for a new government, fully 2/3 of them say, I'd be willing to change my vote from my first choice of whatever center-left party I have to another one if I thought they actually had a much better chance of beating the Conservative candidate. That's a very sizable fraction of the population.
The last attempt at a federal coalition in 2008 flamed out because of the involvement of the Bloc Québécois. During the last election, Stephen Harper often used the possibility of a coalition to scare voters.
I can't say it more plainly than this. We will keep taxes down. A coalition of the other guys, NDP-led, Liberal-led, will raise your taxes.
The public at this time out are not going to be nearly as frightened by the coalition word as they were last time. So I don't think it has the same potency or value as a late stage tactic that it did, and it was an effective tactic in 2011.
It is clear that if Mr. Harper wins a minority government, the pressure on the other party leaders to depose him will be overwhelming. To begin with, it will come from former party leaders like Ed Broadbent.
If Mr. Harper gets a plurality, he will be obligated soon to have a vote of confidence in the House. And at that time, in my view anyway, if he had not obtained a majority in this election, the New Democrats and the Liberals should come together and bring down his government and form some new configuration, because they will represent a majority of opinion in the country. And the other parties have I would argue now, not only the constitutional right, but the constitutional obligation early after an election in Canada to put together an arrangement in government to provide some stability to Canada, and in this case also some elements of progressive change in policy.
I think it's very rare within the context of Canada's present political culture that you'd see a coalition between the two opposition parties. it is more likely that one of the opposition parties would say to the other, you form a government, we have terms and conditions for your throne speech, for your budget, and we will give you confidence for a couple of years at least, providing we move along that path.
In 2009, Liberal leader Michael Ignatieff decided to temporarily support a continuation of the Harper minority government, a scenario unlikely to be repeated.
If Mr. Harper was to continue with a minority and the other parties were to say, oh, we'll go along with that, we'll wait, it's going to collapse, maybe we'll win a majority in 6 months, I believe that would quite possibly be political suicide. The intensity of desire for change amongst those in their portion of the electorate is really, really high. And frankly, I would expect you will find people with pitchforks and torches on Parliament Hill if those parties say, well, we're going to look the other way and let Mr. Harper rule.
Among those Canadians who seem favorably disposed to coalitions is Governor General David Johnston. In a rare 2010 interview, he said, I think most jurisdictions will from time to time have coalitions or amalgamations of different parties, and that's the way democracy sorts itself out. Stephen Harper would likely have a tough time convincing him that is not the case. Terence McKenna, CBC News, Ottawa.